Now, I'm sure this will come as a shock to absolutely no one, but when I was a kid, Pokemon ruled the roost. It was literally everywhere and on everything. While I rode the train a bit longer than most of my peers did, there's no denying the massive impact it left on a lot of childhoods and pulp culture in general. But it also, for a brief time, inspired a lot of stuff in the video game world as well. You might be thinking, well, no duh, but think back really hard. How many games, especially on the handhelds of the time, had similar styles or ideas behind them? How many things were written off at first just being Pokemon clones, regardless of how accurate that accusation was? Digimon, anybody? And don't deny it, when you first heard of Digimon, you were just as quick to accuse it of being Pokemon with less Poke, just like the rest of us were. Another of these unfortunate victims was Dragon Warrior Monsters, released here in the USA in 2000. This might not seem super close to the Pokemon craze at the time, but I think we all forget just how long that initial wave of Pokemania actually lasted. Anyway, the game itself, a spin-off of Enix's Dragon Warrior series, or Dragon Quest if you live in Japan, got caught in the crossfire like so many other games, though it did manage to get fairly well received critically. I picked it up pretty close to its initial launch date, mostly because I was willing to give anything a shot if it seemed even tangentially like Pokemon at the time. And I can still remember the first thought I had when I popped the game in. Holy sh**, this isn't anything like Pokemon! Yeah, I had censor bleeps in my brain when I was a kid. I recently revisited the game for no real particular reason aside from nostalgia and curiosity, and that sentiment still remains at the core of my mind when I think about the game. While initially as a child it was more out of a sense of disappointment, nowadays it's more out of the ridiculousness that I could ever think that comparing an apple to an orange was a good idea. The story of Dragon Warrior Monsters does not matter in the slightest. Seriously, the story is incredibly shallow and out of the way, even in terms of an 8-bit Dragon Warrior game. The game follows the adventures of a young boy named Terry, who you can rename to be anything you wish, who, after a night of roughhousing with his sister, Milio, witnesses her being kidnapped by an impish monster named Warubo into their dresser. Huh. Terry jumps in after them and finds himself spirited away to the Kingdom of Great Tree, where he is immediately assigned the title of Monster Master and tasked with competing in the Starry Night tournament in Great Tree's name. While Terry is only interested in finding his missing sister, the King of Great Tree tells Terry that he can earn a wish for whatever he wants in the world if he wins the Starry Night tournament. And so, after being given a token monster to start off his quest, Terry sets off into these mysterious traveler's gates found throughout Great Tree in hopes of gathering more powerful monsters and earning the right to compete in Starry Night. And that's it. There is literally no more plot than that until you actually get to the Starry Night tournament, and even then, what little there is isn't that surprising. I mean, I wasn't exactly expecting deep storytelling from a Game Boy game to begin with, and what little there is enough to give the player agency, that's for sure. There are also a handful of little side stories that you can learn about by talking to the people of Great Tree frequently, as they'll almost always have something new to say to you every time you progress the quote-unquote main story by competing and winning in the arena. So how does the game play? Well, it shares a heck of a lot in common with its 8-bit NES counterparts from way back when. Luckily, the game plays more smoothly than they do. I'd say it's pretty close to how Dragon Quest 1 and 2 remakes on the Game Boy played, at least on a technical level. As Terry, and with a team of up to 3 monsters who fight for you, you journey into these traveler's gates. Every gate is made up of several floors, and in order to beat a gate, you need to make it down to the bottom floor and beat the boss, all while encountering wild monsters that you'll have to fight your way through and, if you're lucky, recruit to your side. And this is where the game can kind of throw you if you aren't expecting this, but the game itself is kind of a roguelike. Every individual gate will have the same number of floors every time you go into it, but the layout of every floor is different every time. They start out simple, made from a few pre-made cookie-cutter layouts, but it doesn't take long before these, let's call them what they are, dungeons, start to get bigger and more complex, or start adding in floors with special obstacles, such as spaces on the ground that can cause damage to your team if you step on them. And then there are special floors like the labyrinths, the forest maze, or the conveyor belt puzzles. Unlike ordinary floors, these guys will always have the exact same layout every time you run into them, but you aren't allowed to see a map while on them, so if it's your first time through one of these places, it can waste a lot of time. There are other random things that can happen while delving into dungeons as well, such as warping into cathedrals where you can be healed, shops where you can buy and sell as much as you want, treasure rooms with a bunch of chests or mimics lying around, or even arenas where you can't leave until you've beaten 3 other trainers in a row. You can also run into foreign trainers out in the field who, if you beat them, will offer you special rewards. Priests will restore your team to full power after their defeat. Wizards will instantly warp you to the last floor of the dungeon before a boss room. Warriors and merchants will always give you a warp wing and another rare item, usually a sirloin steak, or one of the many elemental staves you can acquire. Wandering around these levels is primarily how you're going to get your items and gold in this game too. There are tons of useful items just laying around in these dungeons, including huge piles of gold, which is good since random battles don't actually get you any money. You'll have to pick up gold off the ground or sell your excess items for that, and because you have a very limited inventory, you can only carry 16 items total, you'll want to start selling anything you don't use ASAP, especially since gold becomes very important for entering the tournament classes later on. Yes, you could stash extra items in the vault, but since the vault can only hold something like 48 items total itself, and a lot of the rarer items are more useful as gold fodder, then there's not a big reason to use it unless it's for holding on to spare warp wings, which are always useful to have on hand in case of an emergency. You're also incentivized to use those warp wings to warp back to town as soon as you feel you're in over your head, because if your team gets wiped out, you lose all the items and half the gold you were carrying. Add to it, you can't leave a dungeon without a warp wing, so if you happen to find yourself going up against a boss monster that you just can't handle, or you're too beaten down from the trek, you might want an easy out. Unfortunately, this type of progression is one of the biggest criticisms of the game because it gets really tedious really fast. The first few Traveler's Gates aren't that bad because they have a low number of floors and the floors themselves are pretty small. But as the game progresses and the floors get bigger and more complex, you find yourself just doing everything in your power to skip over these floors and just get to the end already. Some of the later dungeons can be over 30 floors deep, and while that might not sound too bad, I assure you it can be quite a slog. You can kind of mitigate the tedium if you happen to luck into having a monster that knows map magic or other utility spells similar to it, but good luck finding one of those early on in the game. It's weird too, because as much as I make it sound like going through the Traveler's Gates is important, they're actually kind of optional. Well, technically they are, but logically they aren't. See, the way that you unlock more gates to explore and get closer to the Starry Night tournament is by beating classes in the arena, starting out at G class and working your way to S class. You can enter any class in the game at any time so long as you have the money for the entrance fee, but if you actually want a prayer at winning an advanced class, you need some pretty tough monsters. Since you can freely select any class at any time, though C through S doesn't become available until after you beat D class, you could potentially skip a bunch of the classes if you were powerful enough. But especially early on, the chances of that happening are pretty slim unless you were incredibly grind happy or had a very intimate knowledge of how to manipulate the breeding system, which I'll get into soon. You can freely explore the town of Great Tree between stints in the gates, though some of the facilities won't be available until after you first win in the arena, and apart from uncovering some secret Traveler's Gates after certain events, or talking to the townsfolk for potential hints or backstory, there's not a lot to see around here. For most of the game, the bazaar, for example, is practically barren, and kind of redundant given how generous the game is with throwing items at you in the gates, so yeah, it's basically just your hub, but it's a sizable hub, with quite a bit of walking between each of the main facilities, so it can also get tedious to navigate. Not because it's tough to find your way around, but because getting between places can feel so damn slow. There are some shortcuts that you can access that make it a little faster, but I still don't think it totally mitigates the problem. Geez, I've been talking for a long time now and we haven't even gotten to the meat of the game, the battle system. If you've played any of the older Dragon Quest games, you'll feel pretty at home right here. Terry himself doesn't participate in battle, instead giving orders to his monsters to fight, and the fights play out in that classic format where you are facing the enemies from a first-person perspective with your stats at the top of the screen. Battles can be, at maximum, a 3-on-3 affair, and your objective is to pummel the things into oblivion before they can do the same to you. While you can give specific direct commands to the monsters, doing so is a bit tedious, as you have to go through the plan menu, go down to command, and then select the command or skill to give them. The game encourages you instead to trust your monsters to make smart decisions on their own and select from 3 generic plans that will determine how a monster will fight. Selecting Charge will make the monster go on an all-out offensive, using any skills or attacks that are guaranteed to cause the most damage to the most monsters. Mixed will make a monster use a mix of both attack skills and supportive skills, like status ailments or buffing spells. And Cautious will make the monster defend itself and only use skills when it needs to heal itself or its teammates. Using these plans actually becomes necessary in the tournament battles because you're forbidden from giving direct commands and using items in those. So you've basically got to hope that you have a balanced team in there that can take care of itself. And most of the time you probably will, all things considered. You can also have Terry use an item, like a healing herb or an antidote or what have you, but when you use an item you forfeit actually giving commands to your monsters, who will usually just use the entire turn to attack after an item is given if you haven't already set their behaviors beforehand. Using the plans does speed up battle considerably, and I only really find myself giving direct commands to the monsters if I'm in the middle of a boss fight and want to use a very specific strategy. But let's say you don't want to completely destroy your enemies and instead want to try coaxing them to your side. Well, this is yet another part where the game can get very frustrating, especially later on. See, unlike in Pokemon, where you just whittle down an enemy and then throw a device at it to capture a monster, in this game, you knock out your enemies, and then if you get lucky at the end of the battle, the last monster that you knocked out will get up and offer to join your party. It is completely luck-based whether or not a monster actually joins you. You can increase the odds of them joining by giving the monsters treats during battle, like beef jerky, ribs, or sirloin steak, and the tastier the treat, the better the odds. But even then, it's still not a 100% guarantee that you'll get the monster to join you. And with every passing gate, the monsters get harder and harder to recruit, with many of the middle and late game monsters taking an infuriating number of treats. I can't help but feel cheated when I throw a bunch of ribs and a couple of rare and expensive sirloins at a monster, and they still decide that they aren't interested in joining me afterwards. And since using a treat means that your monsters will just attack the enemy that they want to, which can lead to them attacking the monster you want to recruit first and accidentally knocking it out, there's a chance that you're just wasting treats anyway, but if you take out the other monsters first, that means you have less turns to toss meat at the one you actually want to recruit. It's a bit of a catch-22. But where the game really does shine and what can make it an absolute cakewalk is the breeding system. You can breed any 2 monsters together provided they're of opposite genders, no matter how terrifying of a prospect that is. A tiny slime with a giant troll, a fire-breathing weed with a bird made of pure mist, a sentient mirror with a zombified wolf. So long as they're a boy and a girl and they're both over level 10, it's a-okay. But in all seriousness, this not only gives you the ability to create monsters from much later in the game very early, provided you can figure out the proper combinations, but bred monsters are just inherently more powerful than ordinary wild ones. In fact, while I'm sure it's possible to beat the game with vanilla monsters recruited from the wild, the game gets infinitely more tedious as they have lower stats and lower level caps, and can also only naturally learn 3 different spells each. Bred monsters have to be hatched from eggs at level 1 and the parents return to the wild after they lay the egg, but the children have higher stats, higher stat growths, and higher level caps than the basic versions. Add to it, bred monsters inherit all the skills that their parents knew before being bred. Want to make a tanky attack character that also knows how to heal or poison the enemy? Totally possible if you breed smart. Of course, even if you don't breed smart, breeding monsters over and over constantly basically breaks this game's difficulty curve over your knee. Since bred monsters keep gaining pluses next to their name, it basically means that as long as monsters keep getting bred together, they'll keep getting stronger and stronger. Taking time out every now and then to just breed one of your monsters with another one regardless of the resulting monster is basically guaranteeing a power boost. I remember this game being brutally hard when I was a kid, to the point where I gave up on it a rank or 2 away from the Starry Night tournament because I just got frustrated with how difficult it was. And during my recent revisit, I steamrolled the entire game by just playing normally and periodically stopping to breed monsters. I didn't pay attention to levels or breeding charts or anything, I just bred them haphazardly, but it still gave me enough of a power boost to comfortably squash every beast in my way, and even take out most of the boss monsters with little effort. So instead of being incredibly frustrating, the game became infinitely more boring. Even when I got to the last Traveler's Gate before the Starry Night tournament, and even the 3 boss fights at the end of that gate, while it did pose more of a challenge, didn't keep me engaged for very long. And while there were several more gates I could have gone through after finishing the main campaign, I just didn't feel like playing it any further. I'd sated my curiosity and didn't feel like the game had much more to offer me. In terms of graphics, there isn't a whole lot to say. The game does look nice for a Game Boy RPG, and the basic colors instilled on it if you happen to be playing it on a Game Boy Color do look very nice. The sprites of the human characters aren't super detailed, but I'm very impressed with the fact that every individual monster in this game, of which there's an impressive amount, all have their own individual overworld sprites when following you around. And in battle, seeing the monsters from first person is always great to see. Akira Toriyama's design work for all the monsters, both new and classic, really shines through, though most of them do lack in the color department, often consisting of one overwhelming color in all of their designs, or maybe 2 different shades of the same color for simplicity's sake. All the same, they all look pretty nice, and while there's no actual animation in battle aside from some simple effects when one of your monsters uses an attack skill, the individual designs still lend a lot of personality to these miniature minions. And musically, again, it's an 8-bit Dragon Warrior game. The tunes are few, but what few there are pretty nice. Most of the time. The main theme of the arena and Great Tree can get pretty tiring after a while, but when you first hear them, they're nice enough, easy on the ears, and give a sense of safety and normalcy. The theme of the Starry Night Shrine, where you go to breed monsters and hatch eggs, is just a fantastic earworm, and in my opinion, the best track in the game. But if you want to get into the tedious and repetitive, the main theme that plays in every single Traveler's Gate certainly qualifies. It's not that it's short or even really that bad when you first hear it, but you hear it on every single floor of every single dungeon, and it begins to wear on you really hard, especially in the mid and late game. It's a shame too, because at the final floor before the boss room in each gate, you get to listen to something different, usually pertaining to the type of boss you're going to fight, which could be something playful, mysterious, foreboding. These tracks are shorter since you only hear them for a brief time on the final floor of the dungeon, but they are a refreshing change of pace, both letting you know that you're almost near the end of a dungeon, and giving you a nice reprieve from the repetitive main dungeon theme. In terms of the rest of the sound design, it is classic Dragon Warrior from start to finish. The sound of magic being cast, the sound of enemies or allies attacking, the sound of warping or hits landing, the sound of battle starting, all of it is lifted pretty much wholesale from the classic games, which isn't a bad thing considering how close to the classics this game can seem at times. And in this day and age, I guess those sounds can be considered quite nostalgic. So how did I find my time going back to this game after so many years? Surprisingly, I still enjoyed it, at first. I won't say the game is bad, as I did find enough interest in it to get all the way through to the end, but by the time I'd finished the first half of the game, I was just starting to get bored with it. Like I said, I was able to pretty much power my way through the entire game without much effort, without really applying any strategy to my team or my breeding. And when the dungeons start to get really long and really repetitive, the game just drains you. I absolutely loved my time starting the game from the beginning, and seeing the massive number of monsters you can breed and befriend became a driving force that kept me going. But it is starting to show its age and lack of real stimulating gameplay, and the randomly generated dungeon layouts and relatively slow travel system hinders more than it helps. It ends up overstaying its welcome by quite a bit, which isn't a good thing to say for a game that is at its heart a portable RPG meant for quick bursts and car rides. But when you have a dungeon system where you can't easily save the game whenever you want, yeah, a bit of a flaw in the design there. The game did get a few sequels down the line, but it never really managed to pick up much steam, as evidenced by the fact that a lot of its installments never saw the light of day outside Japan. Monsters 2, Tara's Adventure, and Kobe's Journey brought it a bit closer to the Pokemon parallel by splitting the game into two different versions, while Dragon Quest Joker brought the game into full 3D on the DS. Joker received a direct sequel of its own that remained Japanese exclusive, and that's about when the spin-off series went dormant. It's a bit of a shame, but elements of the game have been leaking into other main and spin-off Dragon Quest games for years now, so while the series proper hasn't seen any action, it still had an impact on its parent series. If you are interested in trying it yourself, the game was released on the DS eShop in Japan, and physical cartridges of the game aren't that expensive. You can get yourself a decent used copy for about $10 nowadays. Looking back at my younger self, I'm still amazed that I was actually disappointed that this wasn't at all like Pokemon when I first got it. I might have been more disappointed if I had gotten something that was just Pokemon again, but with something else, like robots, or robots again. A lot of them were robot-centric. Anyway, I'll see you all next time, everybody.